Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Tonique's Politics Refresh. I'm one of your hosts, Matthew Lawrence. Getting together today to talk about the weekly news. Joining me, as always, is Robert. Robert, how are you? How was your week?
That was pretty good. Everything's the same in quarantine, but we're getting there. We're getting to opening up, which is great. Glad to be here with you, Matt.
Yeah, it is great. Is your bracket busted? Mine is completely destroyed. I
did
way worse than I thought.
I had Illinois and Iowa in the final, so I've been out for a while.
I have Michigan and Arkansas, but I think, did Arkansas win?
Yeah, they did
last night. So
hey, so you're still alive?
I'm still alive. Yeah, I don't think and Gonzaga. So we'll see. I don't think I'm going to win the one bracket tournament, but who knows? If I pick the champion, then maybe I can win some money. So starting off this week, sort of reversing that, not very cheery. Want to talk about something that's pretty sad that happened this week, and that is, of course, the shooting that happened in Boulder, Colorado, where 10 people were killed. And I was just reading, and we were discussing before the podcast started, sort of how it went down and how, terrifying the accounts were. This is from the Denver Post. It was sort of, right on the heels of the Atlanta shooting last week. And a gunman, 21-year-old, entered into a grocery store. And, people were minding their own business, going about their day, doing something that we all do every single week, sort of routinely, and started firing shots with a 9mm handgun with an extended barrel. Ended up killing 10 people and including fatally wounding an officer who showed up on the scene and within 30 seconds sprinted into the grocery store to try and, apprehend this guy. And he unfortunately ended up losing his life. So that's really unfortunate. One thing I did want to mention about this is you had it written here, how we tackle gun control. And the problem with a situation like this one is that it wasn't any type of special weapon. It was a handgun. There are hundreds of millions of these all across America. One thing that someone, I am a supporter of the Second Amendment, but I think mental health screenings need to become a routine part of how people get guns in this country. I mean,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's just at this point we have a mass shooting. It feels like almost every 6 months at this point, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what it feels like. Obviously, our hearts go out to those that lost someone, and it's a horrible thing you don't expect, and it's terrifying. And I couldn't agree with you more about mental health checks. I think that background checks and mental health checks, those are just common sense things, right? Like, these are, why do you need a license to drive a car, right? But don't need a license in the same way. Like, you don't need to be screened in the same way for a gun. And I think that mental health is a huge area that the U.S. is lacking in a couple ways. We need a better mental health infrastructure in this country to help people. And then, in terms of guns, they are too easy to get in this country right now. And they're too easy for bad people to get.
Yeah, well, I think a better mental health infrastructure is one thing to put. I don't think the infrastructure exists at all. Like, within the past 15 years, it's really like now we are starting to understand mental health. And like, this is the work of mental health advocates all over the United States. It's very big in our generation in particular. And really understanding that it's not so much, you do have to go through background checks to get a weapon. And the issue with that is, a lot of these mass shooters, this is the first time they're committing a crime. So this is there's not just going to pop up. Like, there is no red flag, as you will. But one thing that would be a red flag is someone with a history of mental illness, because that's inevitably who is doing these attacks. It is people who suffer like psychotic breaks from reality. They get warped in their own head and they go and buy a weapon for the first time a lot of the times, right? It's not like it's not gun collectors who are, going out shooting with their buddies every weekend that are doing these. It is like opportunistic people going through mental health crisis end up going and purchasing a weapon, committing these tragedies. So I think a 3-day mental health screening, why is that so bad? I don't understand the problem.
It's just, it's so interesting because we have two sides of this issue, right? You have the liberals who now, and the Democrats who want to ban assault weapons. And, I can come down on either side of that. Like, the right to bear arms does not differentiate, but also, what do you need an assault rifle for, right?
But this is the thing. I think the definition what is an assault rifle? Because
right. Well, this is what I'm saying though. Like, the United
States banned automatic weapons and all that stuff in the 1980s, right? Like, there was an assault weapons ban. There was,
yeah.
And now all of these guns that are, it's one shot, one pull the trigger. Like, they're all semi-automatic rifles.
I'm just saying, on the other side though, you have Republicans and conservatives who are completely unwilling to listen to rational reform to guns, right? Like, there's no room for compromise on this issue. It has become one of these, it's almost become part of the culture war in some ways, where you have a hard and fast answer on both sides of the aisle that are in complete disagreement. I'm interested because of the weakened state of the NRA today, to see whether or not, we can actually get to a point between conservatives and liberals where we agree upon something that's rational and would actually help with the problem, like mental health screening, right?
And I think, to your point, I think the culture is changing and going in that direction. And this is because there are polls and surveys they do asking NRA members even, would you be open to mental health screenings? And the responses are almost always unanimously yes.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that it's not the people that actually think this way. It is it's the high level politics that's at play with these issues.
Yeah, and it is part of the culture war. And I sort of want to shift to that, because the worst thing about all these shootings is obviously the people who lose their loved ones, the people who lose their lives. I'm not taking anything away from that. You're not on Twitter, and you're very lucky and very smart and very good for your mental health. Because one of the most disgusting and disturbing things inevitably that comes out of these shootings is, it seems like everyone in the stands and the wings is crossing their fingers, hoping that the identity of the shooter is going to be something that they can use to bash the other side with.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
It's either, we really hope it's a white guy that's killing minorities, or we really hope it's a Muslim killing terrorists, so we can say, this is radical Islam, or we can say, white supremacy is killing us. It's like the common thread here. What do the Colorado shooter and the Atlanta shooter have in common? Is the lack of mental health, right?
Absolutely.
They're both crazy people. They're, they have.
Well, we don't know. I guess we haven't. I mean, we can just infer from their actions, right, that there's something wrong with them. Just on that, in that vein, we have now basically a psychological profile of a mass shooter, right? When we're talking about mental health screenings, we're not talking about anyone with something small wrong with them can't get a gun. You now know what to look out for, right? And then you could refer them to a health service or something of that nature so that they can get help. That is a reform that I would love to see, because I don't think there's going to be any agreement otherwise, between
something that Bill Maher actually brought up. And I think this is probably the second time I brought him up on this podcast, but he was talking about this. Sex seems to be a common thing that these mass shooters lack.
Actually, that's hilarious. It's as funny as anything can be in the face of a horrible tragedy, but
yeah, the people who are just they don't have any real relationships in their life. They're socially isolated people.
Loners.
Right? They're loners. They're these, incels or religious extremists. They beat themselves up. Like this guy in Atlanta was supposedly, in his words, went to these massage parlors because it was too much of a distraction, because he was, they were touching people and he was some religious extremist guy. Like this is what he's talking about. And it's just so strange to think that it could push someone that far.
Well, it's like if you don't have anything else to think about, right? If you have no one in your life, if you have nothing to distract you, and you have a mental illness and you're not seeking help and there's no one looking out for you trying to help you, right? You can kind of understand how someone can fall into a path of, insanity and destruction. But I think that gun reform in this country, if it was going to happen, with this current set of politics and politicians, was going to happen after Sandy Hook, with 30 dead children. Maybe, was it more than 30? I don't remember.
I'm not going to put a number because I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but it was at least 30. And that is something that still to this day shocks me, that we didn't have some form of comprehensive reform or something to fix this horrible problem.
Well, this problem is sort of uniquely American. And one thing I wanted to bring this up because I remembered a little bit of the literature when I was getting involved in this. And it was, what is sort of helping or causing mass shootings is that they happen in these clusters. It's like one happens, then another happens, and another happens. And they sort of form like 4 in the span of 2 months. Mm-hmm. Then it goes a little quiet for a while. And, it reminded me, I was reading this article, NPR, researchers at Arizona State University, her name's Sherry Towers. She's someone that studies diseases. And this is in 2019. She had no idea that she was going to have a big break with COVID, I'm sure. But she studied and wanted to know in her mathematical models, do mass shootings spread? And are they contagious, similar to the way that diseases spread? And she found a positive correlation.
Interesting.
That mass shootings, the data that we have, when they happen, how they happen, and this is defined by 4 or more deaths involved in a gun shooting, attack, was that the way that almost the media covers the mass shootings and sensationalizes this type of violence, these things happen in clusters. They spread. Again, they spread like contagion. And Jillian Peterson, I'm sorry, I think that's her name. I want to make sure I get it right. Jillian Peterson. She found something called the Violence Project. She's from Hamline University. She found similar things independent of Sherry's study. So when she put it in her models, she found like, holy shit, the way that we're covering these mass shooters by putting their face all over the place, by talking about their name, making them famous online, this is sort of encouraging people who would be inclined to commit violent acts to do so in this way.
Yeah, I've always been of the opinion that we should use the person's name and face as little as possible in the media, because of exactly this. It's nice to have data to back that up, and I think that's definitely something that needs to be explored more, and also needs to be brought to the attention of the media in a major way, because they don't want to be responsible for more mass shootings. And it would be, it'd be an interesting case study if you could get them to kind of sign on to that with the first one happening, if you stop using that person's name and face, to see if more follow or not.
Well, and this is something that to circle back a little bit what I was talking about, they use the face and the name because they want to push a narrative.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, you can push the narrative without the person's name or face, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can capitalize on this is from their perspective and dark and something I don't agree with, but they can capitalize on the sensationalism of this if they want to, by just using, the race or, like any other underlying mental health issues or religion or whatever aspect of that person's personality that they want to demonize. But they don't have to glorify the shooter at the same time in other shooters' minds, potential shooters' minds. Yeah.
And we can wrap this up here, but one of the most glaring examples of this that I'm reminded of is the Tsarnaev brothers from the Boston Marathon bombings, where they put his face right on the cover of Rolling Stone. It's like, man, you want to talk about famous?
I mean, that's a fame-based magazine, right? That's
that's Dua Lipa's face. Why are you putting the bomber's face on there?
Right.
So let's shift a little bit to something a little bit more complex and maybe not cheery, but something that I think you and I are both interested in, and that would be the economic agreement that Iran and China just made and with each other. It's been 5 years in the making. It's a 25-year plan. Why don't you tell people about how that happened?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's like you said, it's an economic and security cooperation agreement. This is from Wall Street Journal, defying U.S. attempts to isolate Iran and advancing Tehran's longstanding efforts to deepen diplomatic ties outside of Western powers. It's interesting, right? Because you have China making agreements with countries to tie them to themselves in a way that they're already tied to the U.S., right? In Europe, now we're kind of vying for perfect trading. We're vying to be the more competitive trader with China in a way, and like more tethered economically. You have China bullying its regional adversaries, such as Japan, Australia, South Korea, India, and the rest of East Asia. And now you have them continuing their expansion into the Middle East and Africa in this way. I think this is a huge win for Iran, quite honestly, because they were really looking for a place to sell oil. It's a win for China, but it's a short-term win. In that I think China recognizes that oil is not the way of the future, but they need it in the short term. So Iran finds a way to sell a lot of oil quickly, which is what their economy is based off of.
Right. Like China doesn't really care about the oil. It's more so them helping Iran out because Iran has this thing that runs their economy and they need a way to get through. Bypass U.S. sanctions. I saw one thing that they were planning on doing was opening a Chinese Iranian bank. That's one way they're going to try to bypass these sanctions.
That was actually the piece that I thought was most significant, because the Iranian Chinese bank allows Iran to get back into the international banking system in a way, unless the U.S. is willing to sanction China's banking actions, which it definitely isn't right now for this.
No way.
I mean, it would come that comes in a real confrontation between the U.S. and China. But the financial sector has been the U.S.'s major advantage over every country that it wants to sanction. And if you want to apply smart sanctions, if you want to apply crippling economic sanctions like we have done to Iran, you can destroy an economy, which we did in this way. But if they have a backdoor back into the international economy and international financial sector with this new bank, that's significant. I mean, it will be limited, but in the way that all Chinese banks are limited because, of the risk of nationalization and also currency manipulation. They're not the favored banks of the world because the government is authoritarian, whereas in a democratic government, you have laws, and the stability of the rule of law is what makes the U.S. banking system the world leader. But it's certainly a major win for Tehran in that way. And I mean, in the short term, China definitely needs the oil. That's something that they're constantly trying to expand into. That's why they're so aggressively pursuing the South China Sea. It's for those oil reserves. So I think this is just another example of, we lost 4 years with Trump where, we had a really solid nuclear power agreement. We were letting them back into the global economy. We had resumed diplomatic relations, and Trump came in and tore it up. It's just another example of how Donald Trump actually furthered the interests of China.
Yeah, the JCPOA, China is one of the main sponsors and, signatories of that agreement along with Russia. And this essentially gives them some leverage when the United States inevitably wants to get back into the agreement because that agreement worked. I think what this shows is that the sanctions on Iran aren't working. It's not changing their government. It's making them more steadfast. And they have more control over their people than they ever have because, when America is doing these things to Iran, you're essentially giving an argument to the hardliners in Iran. You're not helping the liberals in Iran.
Well, and when a liberal, comes in, makes an agreement with the U.S., and a year later the U.S. tears it up and throws it away, that is just horrible for liberalism in Iran.
Well, yeah, then you have the mullahs that can say, well, we tried it your way. See, it doesn't work. So now we're going to pivot even more to China. And, Iran and China have been close before. China has been selling Iran weapons since the 1980s. It's nothing new.
So have we.
It's just, so have we. This is just a deepening of that economic tie. And, an interesting aspect of this, because, Iran is obviously looking to evade sanctions. I have a friend who is Persian, not Iranian, Persian. His family came over here before the revolution.
Got it.
He obviously would like to see a huge change in Iran, but he was telling me is, something that sort of confuses or tests like my libertarianism with Bitcoin. So there have been rolling blackouts throughout Iran for the past year and a half. And so what it turns out is that because Iran wasn't able to use international banking system, they have these sanctions. What they've been doing is setting up these giant facilities
to mine Bitcoin?
To mine Bitcoin. They've been buying the technology from China.
That's amazing. That's crazy.
I didn't believe them. And then all of a sudden, Reuters had this great piece about it where they essentially have like millions and millions of dollars invested in these huge facilities where just filled with these servers, mining Bitcoin, and then taking that Bitcoin and essentially using it to avoid U.S. sanctions. And so China is like, yeah, you're just buying all of our, technology, essentially, right? And then they can use Bitcoin to pay. No, you can just use Bitcoin to essentially funnel their money, right?
Like, yeah, I mean, you're operating more like a not a cartel, but a failed state at that point. So I think the U.S. sanctions, they're still working in the way that you have no legitimacy if you're buying and selling things in Bitcoin, right? But it's a smart workaround. It's
going the other way. It's going the other way, right? I mean,
Elon now you're back into
in Bitcoin, right? Like Tesla just bought $500 million in Bitcoin, something like that. Like Bitcoin is the future. They're using it. It's just one of those things that it's untraceable, which is a good thing and a bad thing because bad actors obviously will prefer it. But
well, if it helps you avoid the U.S. banking system, it's smart for Iran to do. It's not the way that a country should operate at the current moment, though.
No, I mean, it's probably not a good idea for an entire country infrastructure to just be like invested in Bitcoin, which,
which has change in market value, significant change in market value.
Right, like 3% dips.
Yeah.
That sort of thing.
That's not where you want all your money going. But just to get back to China in some way, did you watch Biden's press conference by any chance?
I didn't. I've been hearing conflicting things about
what he said about China was brilliant, in my opinion. He said that Xi Jinping is very smart, but doesn't have a democratic bone in his body, which is a very apt breakdown of how that country's being run currently. And he also made the point of China's investing well over what the U.S. is investing in research and development right now. We used to be investing 2% of, it was either the annual federal budget or our GDP, I forget. And now it's 0.7, and we want to push that back up. And he's right. We we need to innovate at either the same or a faster pace than China, in my opinion. As long as we're doing that, we are still ahead because the world is democratic right now.
We've had this conversation you and I before. I mean, that might be an apt way to describe Xi Jinping and China, but the thing is, they don't care. They're not calling themselves, like they're not leading with we're a democracy, right? Like,
right. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is,
and currently they're kicking our ass, like because the United States, because our system isn't allowing us. I mean, they are definitely on the rise. I think
they're on the rise, but I think it's easy to overstate how well they're doing. They have had every nation that matters condemn them for their treatment of the Uyghurs. They have faced international backlash over Hong Kong. We're not doing well right now.
But what's happening with that?
I mean, you have companies being boycotted in China or in the U.S. depending on how they respond to the.
They're not leaving. I mean, companies in the United States will say, you work in Xinjiang province. What they really mean is just move it out of Xinjiang, right? Like
move it out of the slave labor, right? Yeah. But what I'm saying is like and that's creating its own problems within China. So you're setting up for. What I mean more is like, even if you make economic agreements with them, the world is not turning to them for leadership, right?
Not the Western world, but
right. But that's who we're really competing for, right?
Sure, but maybe what Iran is showing and is exemplary of is these countries in the Middle East and Africa who have these systems that typically are crushed by the United States. They're just turning to China. They don't care. They're going to take the money under the table, and
it's not under the table anymore.
Yeah, but China doesn't care what you do with it, right? It's all legitimized through China.
Right, but I guess if you're gaming out this into the long term, right? If China can pick up allies in the Middle East and Africa, right, through their wolf warrior diplomacy and their economic gifts, I guess, if you want to call it that. We're not going to lose Saudi Arabia. We're not going to lose Israel. We're not going to lose Egypt. Even if they invest heavily in their infrastructure, Egypt is still so dependent on the U.S. in so many ways. Like,
sure.
They're going to our enemies or people that, we don't view as, or countries that we don't view as significant enough to foster a real relationship with. And they are doubling down in those places. We can do the same thing with more developed, more economically powerful, more militarily powerful regional competitors with China, and that's what I would love to see. We can, and also, like Europe is going to be a real competition now. It's going to be a competition for buying power. It's going to be a competition for trade. But at the end of the day, as long as they stay democratic nations, those places will not be turning to China, especially as they commit atrocities for world leadership.
Sure.
So
sure.
The U.S. is like, and I said this last time, the U.S. has set up a international system that disproportionately benefits us. We just need to get back into that and keep doing that.
I think the key is at the very end there when you say get back into that. Like, it's just, the way that the United States system is set up is that it's so hard to have like a concerted effort to actually do some of these things, right? Like, you need real majority support, which could happen.
But we can generate that based on competing with China. You can, both sides of our aisle, we agree on this, right? You can disagree on the strategies, but as long as you do it in a smart way, you can actually do this. Like, Trump made the mistake of being a complete isolationist among the many mistakes, but that hurts us in the long run, right? This is a globalized world. This is a globalized economy. We need our allies, and we need to strengthen alliances that we, in the past, have viewed as not very helpful. And I think that, that summit that is his name Blinken? Is that right? Yeah. Am I pronouncing that right? Went to demonstrates that when he said, look, it seems to us like all of your regional competitors are happy to have us back on the playing field. That's a major deal. Like that's the type of action that we need to be taking.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we'll see how this goes, and as long as I think the next Republican that will be elected
will be very telling. Will be very telling,
and will be very anti-China as well. I think there's like a growing sentiment in the Republican Party that is like almost saber rattling to a point where it is like we're done with playing around. So, which honestly makes me a little nervous, but something has to be done. Someone's got to step up to the plate.
I think if you use the rhetoric to rally the people, but then use, the tried and true strategies of the Cold War and of American foreign policy, we can win this. We can come out on top of this. They have structural problems in their country that are not going away and will be heavily exacerbated by their authoritarian rule. So we just need to hold on and, come together as Americans more. And we'll see what happens, right? We have the same structural problems. Well, not the same. We have different structural problems that could equally be our undoing, as demonstrated by the insurrectionists on January 6th.
Yeah. We don't have to get it. We don't have to get into the
Yeah, this is like a whole other thing. Yeah. You wanna move on to our next topic?
I think those are like those Q people are just absolutely insane. I don't think they pose too much of a threat to any legitimate power sources in America. Like a bunch of idiots waving signs.
I meant more that, the Republican Party has become increasingly authoritarian and is limiting the right to vote currently and limiting protesting rights and flying in the face of democracy and refusing to concede elections when they lose them. So, if we lose our democracy, then we will lose internationally for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a big democracy guy, but that's a podcast for another time.
What?
Not a big democracy guy. I want a decentralization as locally as possible.
Oh my God. But how do you choose those leaders?
I don't know if I need leaders to necessarily.
Democratically? Or
yeah, well, there's a thing. It's like you.
Wait, so just to be clear, so at the beginning of this episode, you were advocating for national restrictions on who can buy a gun based on mental health checks, and now you're saying that we would like all of it to be localized to a point where that couldn't exist.
No, that could exist,
but there would be no. Exist. But then, how do you enforce it?
There could be. It's just. Look at me. It's just. When democracy is just such an interesting concept, I don't know necessarily that it works. Like direct democracy does not work. We're a republic for a reason. That's the whole.
We have a representational democracy.
Representational democracy.
That represents the best ideals on the planet.
I guess. I look around and I don't know how many people I want deciding what I can do with my life, and I honestly shouldn't be making decisions for other people's lives as well. The average voter, are they in a position to choose people who should be ruling over me? I don't know. I think that's an interesting philosophical question.
I think it's their right to do so, though. Instead of,
to choose who rules over me, like that's.
It's the right in a republic to express your opinion by voting. Which is,
I think you express your opinion. It's just, hey,
if you absent that, you have a system that is autocratic.
Again, that's why
if you're advocating for like every local mayor to have a lot more power over the people living in their township, I guess I don't see a world in which that works in any meaningful way.
A lot of things are localized in America, though.
Yeah, that's part of what's great about this country.
Yeah, sure. No, I'm not saying I hate America. Trust me, I'd rather live in America than anywhere else in the world. It's just, I hate this, especially in federal politics and presidential politics, where every 4 years, one of these two people get to make so many decisions that control our life in the direction that the country is going. The idea.
Well, I do think that
Donald Trump, that's democracy, right?
Well,
I mean, does Donald Trump represent all of America? Should he be the one at the top that is like just breaking treaties with allies? He gets to decide how many bombs we drop in the Middle East. This guy, totally takes us out of the JCPOA. In terms of foreign policy, I sort of understand that you need someone to represent the United States in a foreign policy, but the power that we put in the presidency.
That's the real issue here. We have put too much power into the executive branch throughout our history, and it's expanded and expanded and expanded, and Congress recently has not done enough to check either their war-making powers or their foreign policy powers, which in the past they've done. I wrote an article about it. It's on Tonique if anyone wants to check it out.
Yeah, so every 4 years we have a popularity contest for which side is going to be living, under the boot of the other, essentially. At least that's how people felt as they were living under Donald Trump, right? I mean, he's an authoritarian fascist, and he's destroying the country.
The Republic was rattled, but it stood, right? And that speaks to the strength of our republic and why we need to further strengthen it instead of what the Republicans are doing, which is trying to weaken it further. I don't know if I would advocate for more state power in the way that you're doing in the face of leadership from a president that wasn't good.
I think there are a lot of presidents that weren't good. I would advocate for more state power, but more even just power in the legislature.
Yes, I think that legislative power is something that definitely needs to be given back over to a more, getting back to what the Constitution actually intended. Taming the prince in a very Machiavellian sense is what the Constitution attempted to do and did well. But as you give the executive branch more agencies, more military power, an expanding role in our economy, all of these things add up to one person having more power, or almost more power than the entire legislature, especially when the legislature is so polarized as it is today.
Yeah, well, this entire system that we currently have, American, if you want to get real deep into this, Robert, maybe sometime me and I, we can have another conversation, but the way the United States government actually operates is that every 75 years or so, the United States has a monarchy, essentially, where George Washington...
During a true time of crisis? Yeah, I'd agree with you.
George Washington... Yeah, well, it does line up with a true time of crisis. I mean, 75 numbers is a round year. George Washington with Alexander Hamilton... Right. George Washington essentially ran the United States government, like whatever he wanted to do.
But the legislature was still being established then, right? So if you want to say that, sure. I don't think that
75 years later after that,
you have the Civil War with Lincoln, and then you have FDR in the Great Depression, and then we're missing. Yeah, well, just FDR all the way throughout, right? I mean, during the Great Depression, he actually expanded the role of the presidency through executive order to include, and through some bills passed through Congress, to include more power over the agencies directly under him, and also more power with our economy. So
the government we currently have is the government of FDR. It's just no one has the strings, really the influence that FDR had, where he was destroying and building agencies in the matter of months.
That's because Congress came in and actually, updated and repudiated some of those issues through bipartisan support.
Well, I think the important here is it wasn't bipartisan support. It was essentially a rubber stamp for whatever FDR wanted. Harry Hopkins.
No, I'm saying after that, when they realized how much power that he was exerting, they had several bills where it was like, you can't fire agencies, you can't dissolve agencies. They gave more autonomy to the agencies, and that helped to strengthen their role and also their ability to disagree with the executive. It's why Dr. Fauci wasn't fired by Trump because he disagreed with him. It's because he couldn't do that.
Well, I think it's also sort of what has led to a little bit of the decay of the Republic in a way, is because FDR was very much, I very much disagree with FDR's politics, obviously, being on the left, but he was this guy who made shit happen. Like
I think during the Great Depression, during World War II, you had to have that, right?
Yeah, you did.
I mean, you had to have someone do those things. And I think the ideals that he fought for, I wholeheartedly agree with. I think he fell short, especially in the area of race and
putting Japanese people in
equality. Yeah, well, I was more talking about New Deal stuff, and then I was going to move into that. But yeah, I mean, we had concentration camps, we had internment camps. Like these are horrible truths about American past.
And I want to know what your thought is on this. Is that these agencies that he set up, once FDR died, the cords that were attached to these agencies and the way that they operated, right? Because he was very much like a CEO. Like he fucking made things work. Those cords were essentially cut. And now these agencies, to your point, a lot of Republicans, they didn't really understand how the government works. And so Donald Trump would get in office and they'd be like, why doesn't he do all these things? Why doesn't he fire,
Yeah, it's because he can't do that because it's illegal.
He can. Donald Trump doesn't understand power. He doesn't understand how to implement any power because, he's an ignorant buffoon, to be frank.
Well, so for all the reasons that I detest Donald Trump and I hate him and his politics and everything that he stood for, I do think he did two great things for Americans. First of all, he revealed what the Republican Party is at the base level and, who they're really appealing to and trying to say without saying. And then second of all, he was an attempted authoritarian who did not possess the political knowledge or wide base to actually pull off a true coup. And I think that we should be thankful for those two things and, make adjustments to our world and our republic based on them. Strengthening the legislature, like you said, giving some more power back to the states probably is a good idea. Making sure that everyone who can and wants to vote and it should be able to vote can vote. Strengthening freedom of speech, strengthening freedom of the press, giving more autonomy to these agencies and more checks to the legislature and judicial branches.
Yeah, I think we have a disagreement where I think that's giving Donald Trump a little too much credit, almost. When he would go out and say racist things and do racist things, and Republicans would continue to support him and agree with him, and when they stood by him through 20 plus sexual assault accounts, when they stood by him through calling Mexicans drug dealers and rapists, when they stood by him through all of these progressive, progression of racism and vitriol and homophobia and sexism. And they just kept supporting him and were actually more rabid fans of him because of it. And then when they stood by him through an insurrection, you really are demonstrated who does what for what reasons. I'm not familiar with Donald Trump's homophobia at all. I mean, I think the reality of Donald Trump was he's this boomer reality TV star, Hollywood guy who's used to just being a bombastic asshole. He's ignorant. He doesn't read. He doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't hire the best people, right? Like he's just he's an ignorant narcissist. That's who he was. I mean, I don't think he was anything necessarily like it wasn't like this insidious attempt, which is why.
Right, but that's kind of what I'm saying.
Well, two things. I think one is it sort of goes to show my point from earlier that this guy who can get elected should not have power over the people. It should be going to the legislature, like you said, right? We need to make sure that the presidency's powers are diminished. Okay, it needs to be not as important. Second, it's going to be scary because they treated Donald Trump as if he was this guy that was in the back room, like, twiddling his fingers, thinking about how he's going to throw this authoritarian coup. Or be an authoritarian, sorry. The next person.
Yeah, the next person could actually do it.
Can actually do it.
Right. They came in and they rattled democracy to its foundation, right? And now you're seeing in these Republican states, you are seeing a suppression of voters. You are seeing the freedom of protest and speech greatly diminished. We are seeing the core foundations of our democracy just beaten to death by Republicans. And the thing is, it will depend greatly on whether or not the electorate responds immediately, like they did in the face of civil rights and the continuance of LBJ's presidency after the Civil Rights Bill became his central focus. We will have to see whether or not the electorate today still values democracy in the same way that Americans have historically.
Yeah. Again, I mean, I feel like people always say that this next election is the most important election of all time.
I'm not saying that.
No, I'm saying that. I'm saying I think Joe Biden's going to be a one-term president. I just think he's going to step down. I think he's going to step back.
He said he was going to run again in 24.
I mean, how old is Joe Biden? Like, I don't know if he can handle 4 years of being president of this.
78. He might step back. I also think Joe Biden is, the person that has always done what he believes needs to be done for America. Right? Like, I think that is how he looks at the world.
Except when he was, backing the credit card companies in Delaware, and that's the reason Elizabeth Warren, got into politics, was to fight against Joe Biden. But I sort of take it. I sort of take what you mean. Because Joe Biden is a typical politician, right? I mean, it was for most of his career. If you want to get to that point, it is maintain the party line, lobbyist, sort of putting together what, for him in particular, Delaware, why all the credit card companies are there. It's because he was the one at the forefront of a bunch of those bills that sort of let them skirt by regulations and taxes. I mean, he did that for his state. Good for Delaware, I guess. They got a big boom out of it. But I don't know. I think he's going to step back. He'll probably tell Kamala to run, right? And she'll be the leading candidate going into 2024. And the Republicans, they don't really have a candidate outside of what seems to be bubbling Ron DeSantis. That's the only.
I think it's going to be Cruz. I actually think he can win nationally. I think he can win nationally in a different way than a lot of people would expect. I think
he's lost a few times.
But he came second to Trump, right? This is speculation, right?
Yeah.
Ted Cruz got beaten over the head recently for a couple things that he totally deserved it on. DeSantis is not, in my opinion, charismatic enough to capture the Trump base without going far right enough to disillusion the suburban voters that Republicans need.
No one's as charismatic as Trump. That 2015 run, it was like, that's the reason the media gave him so much free coverage, was because, again, he's a reality TV star.
Well, you either hate or love, right? You didn't. Right. No one had a neutral reaction to him. We'll see. I don't think DeSantis is nationally popular enough in a way.
Or worse. Now that I'm thinking about this, because I heard her go on Ben Shapiro show, actually, and I do not like her at all. Nikki Haley is going to be making a huge run.
Nikki Haley, I could see pulling it out, but I don't think the Trump base trusts her or likes her. I guess, if Trump endorses her, sure. But I think Trump's going to endorse someone in the primaries. I don't think he's going to stay on the sideline until after that.
He's starting his own Twitter. Did you hear about this?
His own Twitter?
He's starting a social media company.
Oh, I knew he was going to do that. Cool.
Yeah. So he'll be around. It's funny because he can't tweet anymore. So he now puts out these press statements that are 2 sentences.
Yeah, they're insults, right?
Yeah, they're basically tweets.
I don't.
He would support Nikki Haley. I think he would, just because she was his UN.
Well, but she came down on the other side of this, right? She had those statements that were really repudiating him.
That's fair. I don't think he would support
Trump. Just holds a grudge, right?
Yeah, that's true.
there's no one that does it quite like him in that way.
But Nikki Haley could put out a statement, say I'm sorry, and Trump would totally eat it up. I mean, that's just who he is. You just got to feed his ego, and he'll totally switch around on you.
I mean, we'll see. But what I think is going to happen is that he will back someone well before even if it's not a formal endorsement, he'll back someone that is crazy. He will back the most crazy person in the room that most closely follows him in the primary. And that person will either win or come damn near close to winning compared to a more moderate conservative.
Yeah, right? Well, I think moderation, like we've talked about before, the moderate, it's gone. There is no such thing as moderate politics anymore.
But I'm not even talking about a true moderate. I'm talking about someone like Nikki Haley who just doesn't present as like actually insane, right?
He's Marjorie Taylor Greene. He's gonna back her up, pump her up for the next 3 years.
I think she's gonna probably lose in her next election in 22, but we'll see.
We'll be surprised because, dude, we haven't talked about the Q stuff at all on this podcast, but that shit is crazy.
It's
crazy how many people still believe this. I mean, my friend's mom thought Trump was going to be president on like January 21st, like posting on Facebook, like, you just wait for the arrests. This is a smart woman who, runs her own like consulting business. People get, normal people are down this rabbit hole.
That's just tough. But the thing is, all of that craziness is really good for Democrats at the end of the day. As long as you don't, as long as you hold on to like these elections, if you're presented with a Q candidate, right, which is a Trump candidate, you're now at a point where 30% of Republicans are disgusted by the insurrectionist movement, and you are hemorrhaging voters, right, to independence. If you keep putting forward those voters, you're either going to persuade people that would normally vote for you to not vote, or they will vote for Democrats, right? Just to keep those people out of power. And I think
it depends on what type of Democrat. I think the Democrats.
Well, that's what I'm saying. If you put forward a Joe Biden.
Yeah, okay. It's one thing to
if you put up Joe Biden, or you put up Kamala Harris, who has just broken the tie on the on the COVID bill and a hypothetical infrastructure bill, right? They can point to her, like left-wing agenda. I mean,
she doesn't. She's a class. I mean, she's an authoritarian. Like, she's locking people up in California for drug crimes.
I don't know about that.
As the AG.
Yeah, but that's the thing is, like, she like Biden has this complicated record where she's not a true progressive. She's not a true, like a Warren or a Sanders, right? And those two will both be too old to run against, the vice president at that time. If we're gaming this out, I do think it's going to be Biden. I think Biden is going to see at least one more major piece of legislation passed. Under this Congress, I think he can get the infrastructure done because of they just re-legalized this type of petty bargaining where senators and House members can get certain things for their districts put into place.
Pork.
What?
It's the pork.
Yeah. So I think you can get an infrastructure bill through, right? And that'll be popular with the majority of Americans, and it'll be popular with a significant portion of Republicans. And as long as the economy doesn't go to hell, right, you will see just a general acceptance of Biden and his policies. Like, you will see the end of COVID, right? As long as a new variant doesn't emerge that is vaccine resistant, you will see the economy open back up. Like, we will be having dinner with our families and our extended families, and on Christmas. Like, these are all things that Americans will just feel like their lives are better. The stock market hit an all-time high recently. Those Republican fears of
the stock market. The S&P is up 76% over the past year. During a worldwide pandemic where there's unemployment, businesses closing. At what point is the reality of the stock market so divorced from what feels like reality? Boom and bust cycles happen. They happen every about 10 years. There's a huge economic boom. It comes crashing down and the reality sort of gets reset.
Sure.
When that happens, the United States, I think, is in a really tough position because we've really blown everything out sort of out of necessity because of COVID. We've spent $6 trillion where World War II cost in today's money $4 trillion.
Well, I think like we've had that bust, right? Like we had the COVID kind of busted us in that way, and the unemployment rate is still there.
Divorced from it. The stock market isn't reflecting what feels like the real economy.
Yeah. Well, I guess what I'm more talking about is like chipping away at the Republican base, which is what happened in the last election, which is why they lost the presidential, right? They lost the suburbs badly. And as long as Democrats prove that, under their leadership, the economy is doing fine, the stock market's doing fine, those people will remain with us. I would find it very hard pressed for a Republican in the Trump fashion to appeal to the voting base of Democrats, which are, like much more likely to oppose a Republican candidate who is supporting Donald Trump.
Yeah, sure. Totally possible. Okay, well, we did go quite a bit over.
Yeah, we went quite a bit over, but this is a good discussion.
It was a good conversation, and we'll continue it next week, I'm sure. We didn't get a chance to talk about the Suez Canal being clogged up and all these companies being disrupted for global trade, having to take the long way around the Horn of Africa. But hopefully, maybe next week, it'll be dislodged. Yeah. Isn't it funny how, like...
We started talking about China, right? China and Iran.
One ship being stuck is like, they can't get it out? Like, how the fuck can they not get it out? Like, I don't really understand. I've seen the pictures. I don't understand how it's still stuck.
Yeah, I know, right? Like, why don't you just use another ship to push it?
Push it, blow it up, do something.
I don't think blowing it up would be a good solution because then you just have a ton of rubble there. Yeah. I don't understand it either. But I'm not an engineer. Yeah, I'm sure there's a very logical, reasonable explanation that puts forward, the complexities of piloting a ship the size of the Empire State Building and in a shallow canal that was built in the 1880s. And I'm sure there's some reason, but I also feel like you just go straight, right?
Yeah. I don't understand. So next week, let's do some studying about this. We'll give a big update on the Suez Canal.
Yeah, hopefully it'll be fixed by then.
Still breathing. Robert, are you want to plug anything? Are you running anything this week?
Yeah, I just put out an article about Andrew Cuomo and how he is in the last year has both rose to a presidential level of leadership in the U.S. through the COVID crisis, and now has come crashing down in the face of 2 back-to-back impeachable scandals. So check it out; it's on Tonique. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Robert. My name is Matthew Lawrence. Make sure you guys check out latonique.news to get all your info on politics, culture, sports. They got a bunch of great writers over there. Talk to you next week. Thanks. Bye.